Few comments before we actually start getting to questions. I think we had three very interesting and exciting tour from three different places between Cairo, Istanbul, and Newark, New Jersey. So a couple of comments before we just move to some questions. Just reflecting and probably more raising questions rather than answering anything on David's Sims. David was talking about Cairo, the city, and looking at the growth that we have. Just a bit of a demographic reality. Egypt's population, since we have a census, has been doubling every 30 years. So first numbers we have in 1882, Egypt was about 4 million. In 1920, it was 10. In 1950, it was 20. In 1980, it was close to 40. Now it's 80. In 2040, we're going to have 160 million people living in Egypt. So Cairo, as a city of 15 million inhabitants, is going to double. The question is, what exactly is going to double? Are we going to double the formal city, the informal city, the desert city? What would it look like? So that's just something as a first reflection. And this is a demographic reality that has nothing to do with, it's not something that's easy to change. The number might be a little bit less or a little bit more, doesn't make any difference in reality. So how is that going to change? If we look at the informality that's happening, we're looking mostly at the physical side. But I think what's more important is the socioeconomic, the social and the economic. Why is anybody living in a very tiny place, in a very informal, in a densely populated, why is everybody building this way? It's a very logical decision. You're maximizing access to jobs, and you're maximizing access to your social network, your family and friends. This is the social and the economic dimension. And that creates, the answer is the physical reality that we're facing. So that's one dimension. The second thing, we don't have the institutions that are able to regulate that, whether it's the state's institution, whatever we want to call them, regional, municipal, state institutions in general. So what is this going to leave us with, and being able to manage it? If we compare to a place like Newark and the urban renewal that we went through, I think urban renewal is basically a simple statement that we don't like what this informal, ugly place looks like. We don't like probably the people and the place. So let's get rid of the place, and hopefully we'll get rid of the people alongside. That's a simple statement that it puts. I don't think we can do this in Cairo. I don't think you can get rid of 20 million people. Where would you put them? So the reality of urban renewal that you had in the US in the 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, is not something, is not a practical solution. So what would you do with something like this? You showed us a perfect example of how city planners can intervene, how city planners can act as arbitrators, as managing kind of a process that would help. How would something like this be actually applicable? We also have an example from Istanbul, probably something in between the reality of Cairo and some sort of formal process that you would have that we would love to have. So how would that work? Another comment on Damon's presentation is actually, I think, the power of the narrative. That when you have a certain narrative that stays throughout decades and kind of labels a certain space or a certain community or leaves us with a certain stigma. That's one of the challenges you faced. And I think we have a similar challenge in dealing with informality. There's that stigma, a narrative that this is something we don't like, we would love to get rid of, and would love to see something like an urban renewal movement, but that's not practical. So what are you going to do? Especially that's improving. So I think this is more of the question rather than the answers. Something that's very intriguing from the Istanbul experience is that formalizing now in the age of internet and all the crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, all of those tools, doesn't always mean that you're acknowledged by the state. There are other ways of formalizing what you're doing and putting it in a map, in an application, in a formal document that people can see and look at. It's actually a very, very interesting way of formalizing that goes beyond seeking acknowledgement from the state for an existing reality. I think that's an interesting lesson from a digital age that we can bring back. So let me just get some reactions in the same sequence from the panel, and then we'll open it for questions. David, if you have a quick reaction. Or whatever you.
Not really. Like I said, 20 minutes is not long enough. But it was interesting that in both the other two presentations, a lot of focus was put on transport and accessibility and the dominance of the private car, and how you might deal with it. It's a big issue. Now, if in Newark 60% of the people use private vehicles, and that must be, the 40% must be one of the highest in all of the United States.
Second.
Yeah. I don't know what is in Istanbul, but you at least have your common taxis and attempts to do it. I don't know what car ownership there is. Just a little reminder, as of 2008, in Greater Cairo, there was only 11% of families had access to a private car. So we're talking about 89% of the population of Greater Cairo have no private car and little hope of ever having one. And yet, on the other hand, as everybody can see, it is the private car which generates most of the traffic and the traffic problems. So it comes back to what we heard in Newark and the ability of these facts to get out there. That, I mean, does this mean that no one cares about the 89%? We see this in Cairo and in Egypt a lot, certainly on terms of land use. But I think the question is, how could these figures are so startling? Why is nobody, the government, there's not even any of the political parties talk about upgrading informal areas. There's a little idea of charity, and Mohammed Sobhi has this little program. But basically, it's not just half the population, it's probably over 80% of the new population in Cairo are going to these places. And wouldn't it be a little more logical to look at them for once? So anyway, that's it.
Ayman?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say one quick thing, because I think I'm more curious to hear what others have to say. I think being an architect, being someone who, I always say that, we're the ones who care, basically have to care about the things that no one else cares about, right? Like, if I talk to my father, it's like this brick or this brick. He's like, it's a brick. So those are the things that we care about. One thing that seems very clear, even when one's looking at the most extreme version of, say, a gated, defended, fortressed community or building, is that no matter what, you can't have your own built environment, right? Even if it's if anything, a tall wall and a gate is a symptom of that rather than a proof that it's wrong. And so, I think as we think about the market, professor of entrepreneurship, and democracy and the built environment, this trio, I think, is quite volatile, and certainly, today, we are, seeing, attempts to maybe pretend like we can have our own private built environment, right? And that the market as an abstraction is able to animate and to sustain such a thought. And I guess I like to think that as long as one is looking closely enough, one knows that's not true. And so then it leaves, the question to us of how do you navigate that?
You can skip if you want.
We can quickly give the figures on the car ownership in Istanbul, but Gregor knows them better than I do.
Okay, so I think still in Istanbul, even though you wouldn't imagine, I think the car ownership is still half of the average European car ownership. But it's kind of the same story as you were saying here. It looks much more massive than it really is, but imagining with the growth of or the wealth of Istanbul rising, of course everyone will want their private car. Basically you would not be able to move around in the city. But that's just one, I think, aspect of many problems or many, let's say, problems of the city.
Let's take a round of questions, comments and discussions, and we'll take probably 3 to 5 and then get the panel to respond, and hopefully do another round and get the panel to respond again and then conclude. So let's start from you, Mark.
Is this on? Yes. I have one question for David Sims and one for our colleagues from Istanbul. For David Sims, you've stated repeatedly in the last couple of years that the most important thing that can happen for urbanism in Cairo is a crash program to expand the mass transit system. How do you actually think that that can happen? Is there a clear path from where we are today to the political will and the public investment and private investment that's required to significantly expand mass transit? Now, for our friends from Istanbul, I was there a few weeks ago. I was tremendously impressed by the amount of public transit that there is, and even in the last couple of years, the expansion of beautiful infrastructure for public transit. A lot more is being built. I was astounded by how bad the traffic is still, despite that. And what is the explanation for the fact that here all of this investment and effort is going into expanding the public transit system, and yet, dishearteningly, the traffic there is almost as bad as it is in Cairo?
Take another question. There was a question from here, please. 2 questions from here.
أنا عندي سؤالين هسألهم باللغة العربية. أول سؤال لديفيد سيمز عن مدى استدامة المناطق الغير رسمية، بالذات المناطق اللي هي وصلت فيها الكثافة لحوالي 500 لغاية 900 أو 1000 تقريبا شخص الفدان. هل المناطق دي فعلا هتقدر تعيش تكمل بالكثافة اللي هي موجودة بيها ولا لأ؟ عندنا أرقام كبيرة جدا وصل 1000 وشوية. السؤال الثاني للتجربة بتاعت اسطنبول. المدينة أساسا بتتكلم على الناس اللي بتقابل بعضها بجد فيزيكالي. هل لما أنا بحول المدينة ديجيتالي هل أنا بضيع المدينة ولا بعمل فيها إيه؟ يعني قصدي هي المدينة بقت إيه؟ هي virtual reality ولا هي حقيقة؟
Sorry. Thank you for a great panel. My question is to Damon, because it was refreshing to see kind of the state side in this whole paradigm. And my question is, how and why has the state been able to introduce participatory approaches and talking to the community and getting the community involved in a lot of the urban planning issues?
Thank you. Let's take one question from the back.
2 quick questions, one to David. David has the tendency in informal areas tended to also go higher, I mean like being more higher rise. I remember in the 80s it used to be relatively wide streets and you know like 2-3 stories building. Another question to the Istanbul team. I mean, the maps look absolutely very nice, but what use is it except for an educated elite? You may have said it, but I missed out on that. Thank you.
And the last question from here, and then we'll get back to the panel. You got a question? Yes.
محمد أبو الخير. ألو. تمام. محمد أبو الخير. سؤالي I'll speak in Arabic. يمكن هو مش سؤال قد ما هي محاولة للنقاش مع المنصة عن فكرة ان الانفورماليتي. لو كنا في السيشن اللي فات بنقول ان الفورمال سيتي بتكون بتمثل الاوردر واللو وما الى ذلك، وان دي حاجة من الكونتمبري لايف ستايل. فالجديد او الفكرة بان الانفورماليتي بتدي حياة في نفس الوقت للمدن. فهل احنا بنتحول لمدن صناعية بشكل او باخر لما بنكون بنحاول نزق المدينة ناحية الفورماليتي او الريجيد لاينز، وهاو تو بالانس ذات؟
So David, please. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Okay. David, do you want to start?
It is true that I've said in the past that massive, big investments in mass transit, basically the metro, would be very welcome here, simply because it will provide an alternative which is not bound by the traffic. So I would much rather see bus lanes, dedicated bus, much less expensive, much finer coverage. But I think trying to deal with the mentality which supports the private car in this current stage that Egypt in is very difficult. So you're right, I have said it, I don't really agree with it because a metro is extremely expensive. And I only think there's only 2 metro systems in the world that actually recover their operating costs through ticketing. So it's another subsidy. But still, it would be a good idea. Moving on to the density of informal areas, you asked the question, Yanni, with the high and increasing densities that we see in informal areas, is this an alternative? Well, I don't think you can ask that question. It is. The history of denial on the part of not only the government, but also the professional classes in Egypt over all of these years. Remember, this started in the 60s, where you could have contained it. You might have provided alternatives, but nobody did. Just let it go. So right now, you're living in a suboptimal situation, and I know you're designers, and you like to talk about design and solutions, but we're way beyond that in Cairo. And I would like to add, yes, densities are getting more and more because it is the highest and best exploitation. If you look at informal areas, this is raw space capitalism at work. It's not capitalism, it's actually family capital. But since no one's going to tell you otherwise, you'll go up as high as you can. And who's to stop it? And finally, order, formality, and informality. Again, you're asking questions which are all very nice in an academic setting. But ask those questions of the decision makers, whether before or after the revolution, and they all think that density is bad. I mean, the whole Cairo 2050 logic is that we have high densities and we have to get rid of it. Well, I would agree if there was some sort of equality in this equation, but there isn't. So density is a result of various factors. And right now, today, I don't think Cairo would function at all if it had the densities implied by the building code. It would have to be 3 times as big. So I hope I answered those things.
Sure. So there was the question about did the government ever become responsive to people? The metaphor that the fellow that I mentioned, Saul Alinsky, uses is building power. And by that, I don't think it's anything too mysterious. Although, I think it is important, and someone earlier brought up the distinction between and the disproportion between the attention paid to, say, national politics and national elections, this is certainly true in the United States, versus the much lesser attention paid to municipal elections and municipal issues. And so Alinsky's notion of building power, is simply producing a public, finding a constituency, and then learning the nuts and bolts of making demands and holding governments accountable. He wrote 2 books his whole life, one at the beginning and one at the end, where he lays that out. And so for me, just as an urban designer, coming into a situation in Newark, basically for a long time, just like you said, the city was very much focused on its central business district, attracting investment, building office towers that oftentimes were completely separated from the city itself, and letting the neighborhoods go. And what that meant was that the needs of neighborhoods, when they were not met by the municipal government, demanded some kind of collective self-organization by the residents of those places. And so a completely and it creates problems as well, but a completely separate agency was built up by these groups in neighborhoods. And so when I was given the charge to become an urban designer, and that meant not just for the central business district, but for the neighborhoods, they were simply the people with all the answers. Like there was no choice. Like either I had to just completely make it up or I had to talk to people who knew. So that's how.
All right. So regarding the question about the Istanbul transport and why it's still congested, I think there are several studies have been conducted on how to solve the traffic problem in the city. There is no one solution, and like when we talk to traffic experts, there is only one thing to do, and that's to increase the different modes. And so to do more metro buses, do more ferries, etc., etc. The city basically is the public system is under capacity. Basically doesn't have capacity yet. So that's why the road, excuse me, the roads are still congested.
I mean, the other component to that is the different systems are designed individually, so the transfer nodes are always very difficult. So even if you would want to take the metro to the airport, you would prefer to take the bus, because for the metro you have to change, and where you change you have to carry your luggage. There's stairs. I mean, these sort of the little details are not thought through. So I mean, there's a lot of investment going in, but it could have gone in a more clever way if they thought the different systems together. But there's a lot more.
I just want to add one of the curiosities, and it's my turn. Now, like there is a new metro line being established under the Bosporus, right, and connecting several lines together. One problem here, and it just underlines the problem Selva is mentioning of not coordinating it, where the metro meets the Marmara, it's called. That it's one station, but since it's planned by two different agencies, the transfer node is a door between those two systems. Great design.
To the question of the maps, yes, of course, initially the maps are an academic discussion tool. But our hope is that I think Istanbul needs a strong image of itself, because the existing image is a historic image, and it doesn't match the reality of it. So you'll see a lot of, still the municipality uses tons of imagery from 1500s, engravings and whatnot, to describe the city of Istanbul. I mean, it's way beyond that now. So, and the city is growing, and there is in some ways a sacred forest to the north, which is also the water reservoirs. But in public's, I think, imagination, there is no boundary how big the city can go. So I think the mappings are interesting for that reason, to start to talk about the boundary of the city. How far should it go? Like, what is its existing extent, and what is the limit? And could we actually generate an image that sticks with people? We always talk about this in conjunction to Copenhagen. Of course, it's a much different scale. But it has a very distinct master plan image of this city with 5 fingers and 5 fingers of green in between. And everyone knows this, that this is the idea of Copenhagen. Everyone on the street knows this. For Istanbul, there's so many archaic images and nothing that matches reality. So for us, it's a little bit search for what is it? Where do we say, let's not cross that border. And for the question about the digital issue, I mean, in a way, the project was supposed to be a future project. So we were kind of looking at future tendencies, and and then we were looking at the younger generation and how it communicates and organizes itself. And if we like it or not, it's really fairly digital how they kind of organize their day. I mean, I have a sister who's 10 years younger than me, and even watching her and how she makes her plans, it doesn't really involve picking up a phone call or kind of knocking on the door of anyone. It's really through either writing SMSs or whatnot. So I think because it was a future project, we had to sort of take this into consideration. And to a degree, if these online platforms or digital media has a public space face to it, I think it could also be useful. So that was also what we were suggesting, that we have to bring maybe the digital into the physical, and maybe then there is something interesting again. Istanbul is also, the people are, the neighborhoods are not there much anymore. The people are, as also everyone in the family starts working, then there's no communities really built anymore. So you have to come up with another potentially another platform to build communities, maybe which is not particularly physical, but its effect is in the physical world. But I mean, it was really kind of a exercise project.
So let's take another round of questions. Start from here, please.
Mukena Makeka. Thanks, colleagues, for a wonderful presentation, all of you. I suppose my question goes to what for me something is still not resolved in my mind, which is at what scale can one really make a difference to one's context? On the one hand, there's the sort of local issue. There is a sort of presentation which talks about, you know, Cairo at a larger scale, and then there's a sort of technology interface. So perhaps what I'm asking you, maybe it's more of a question about the future of regional planning, given the type of issues that we face versus more local action, and given the type of cities that we have, do you have a position or thoughts on whether regional planning is, has a sufficient capacity to make a difference in the cities that we have?
Thank you all. It was really very interesting. I have a question for Damon. Two questions, actually. First is the dimension of time. I would like to hear your opinion about the dimension of time vis-à-vis the value added to the built environment of the participatory process. For example, the riverfront project, is the product dynamic? Would there be other spaces for future generations to participate in designing? I mean, this is tied in time, and there is large value added to the product because of the process. You also said that there was participation in devising the rules. How often would these rules be revised? So that's one thing, this element of time. The second one, how does this participatory experience transfer to built environments that have more diverse and more multiple claims than the community of New York? Because I don't know the population there, but from what you presented, relative homogeneity and relative small size compared to downtown of Cairo or New York or Delhi or Mumbai and so on. Thank you.
شكرا. أنا هتكلم بالعربي برضه وهقول حاجة غريبة في الأول، بس أنا هربطها بالقضايا اللي أنا عايز أقولها. الرئيس محمد مرسي في كذا خطاب ذكر سائقي التوك توك وخد كم مذهل من السخرية، وأنا يعني بفكر في الموضوع ده كتير جدا، لأن أنا شاعر بأن في فخ إحنا واقعين فيه، هو فخ الرسمي والعشوائي، الانفورمال والفورمال. أنا رأيي إن ده فخ نظري كامل، لأن إحنا لازم ننظر لهذا الموضوع، لأن دي حقيقة المدينة. هناك شيء اسمه حقيقة المدينة. حقيقة القاهرة أن لا يمكن أن نفصل ما بين أجزاء من المدينة فصل نظري ونسمي أجزاء عشوائية وأجزاء رسمية، ثم نكتشف أن هذه الأجزاء اللي إحنا بنسميها رسمية عشوائية أكثر رسمية وفعالية في حلولها وفي تكاتفها وفي تمويلها وفي الوصول إليها إلخ. الحاجة الثانية، أنا برضو شايف في فخ آخر اسمه حيوية المدينة التراثية، الانفورمال، نوستالجيا دايما موجودة، حنين إلى الماضي القديم، وأن المدينة الحديثة المخططة لا يمكن أن تكون حيوية. الواقع أن حيوية المدينة ليس لها علاقة دائما بالمورفولوجي بتاعت المدينة. حيوية المدينة لها علاقة بإتاحة الفرص للناس أن تتفاعل مع المدينة. القضية الثالثة اللي مهمة جدا في البرزنتيشن بتاعت دايما، علاقة حق الناس للنهر، يعني إتاحة النهر للناس. وأنا بكتب الحقيقة ورقة بحثية دلوقتي على نهر النيل، وأنا شايف أن نهر النيل فيه جريمة حاصلة فيه، وأنا هشارك حضراتكم بس في لقطة من لقطات هذه الجريمة. أنا وصلت القاهرة أول أمس وشفتها امبارح صباحا. نادي القضاء المصري يقع على النيل، ويتزعم نادي القضاء مستشار اسمه أحمد الزند يصرخ عاليا من أجل حق المصريين. نادي القضاء بيبني حاليا نادي مباشرة على نهر النيل بحائط خرساني ارتفاعه 8 متر بطول على أقل تقدير 200-300 متر يحتقر فيه الشعب المصري. إذا كان ده تصرف نادي القضاة، فأنا رأيي إن إحنا محتاجين مراجعة كبيرة جدا لمفهوم العشوائي والرسمي وحقيقة المدينة. شكرا.
شكرا جدا. سؤال هنا وسؤال ورا وبعد سؤالين ورا and then we'll get back to the panel.
Thank you for the panel. It's been very interesting to follow. And my question is for Dr. Sims, and I'm actually wondering, I have a methodological question, and this is not my field, so I'm curious about how people in this field understand a macro view of the mega city. I think that's the term, of which Cairo is an example. So can you understand cities like this as having a lifespan? Do people think, is the current theory that these cities will continue to grow indefinitely and that will somehow muddle through issues of sustainability right off into the horizon? Or is there a kind of moment when, you know, like a sort of a dying star, it becomes this red giant and then implodes on itself because it just can't support issues like water, supply, electricity, or whatever, you know, that kind of, these very important issues. So that's my question is, you know, is there an understanding of the lifespan of the megacity, and does that have any impact on how people think about it in the present, as a present existent, you know, sort of entity?
Thank you. There's a question from the gentleman here and then the gentleman behind him. Yes, here and then the last. Thank you.
محمد عبد العزيز. هل إمداد المناطق العشوائية بالخدمات والبنية الأساسية هل هو اتجاه لتحسين مستوى المعيشة أم هو اتجاه لتشجيع العشوائيات أو ظهور عشوائيات جديدة؟ شكرا.
And then the last question from the back. Yes.
And it's really a comment, not a question. And I know we're talking about Cairo, but this phenomena of informal housing is not only in Cairo. You have strings of villages, whether in Upper Egypt or in the Delta, that actually don't know where the difference starts between one village of another. It has extended the informal extensions of the villages. Have you go for kilometers and kilometers, and you don't know what, except if there is a sign, what is the beginning of a village or another. Also knowing that some of the population often of Egyptian villages is like larger than some cities in Europe, that raises some questions. Thank you.
So getting back to the panel, maybe we should start in the same order. David?
Right.
Yes.
I don't know if I can cover all of this. ما فهمتش كويس قوي يعني الرئيس محمد مرسي وليس محمد حسني كما قال الرئيس بشير كان بيتكلم على التوك توك كحل مشاكل في مصر. كان مين اللي كان بي
I was saying that heavy criticism and sarcasm was directed towards President Mohamed Morsi for just mentioning the tuk-tuk drivers. Although...
Oh, the tuk-tuk drivers as an issue?
He was not saying issue. He just mentioned them as part of the community, as part of Egyptians. And he was criticized for that. My point, my very simple point, is that speaking of informality, they have a presence and they are doing a wonderful job for a specific sector of the community that because of this segregation between informal and formal, we tend to sort of marginalize their needs.
Yeah, and a lot of middle-class people think they're all teenage kids high on hashish.
And this is exactly the case with the microbuses 20 years ago. Exactly. It was identical case 20, 30 years ago with the white microbus that all of us now are saying that this is a sort of a civilized way of transportation.
Well, I agree with you that there has to be a little closing of the gap and a little more, a lot more sense of reality when you're talking about these issues. And I like the river one. I've been myself counting the number of nawadi that are getting built all along al-maslaha al-amma. So that's the first one. Then imploding stars and megacities, we don't know. No, we'll all be dead long before then. As far as I know, every megacity, I'm talking third world stuff. So, you know, your Jakartas and your Mumbai's and your Sao Paulo's and your Istanbuls are all, it's new territory. Nobody knows. There was, in the 50s and 60s, there was talk about a city could not have more than 5 million people because then you would have collapse and you couldn't provide all the things. But to look at a whole city is important because a lot of the systems are citywide. The road is a citywide system. Even though we have 3 traffic departments in Cairo, in reality, these large cities function, the diseconomies of agglomeration have not yet outweighed the economies of agglomeration. And many people thought this would have happened a long time ago. But as you say, they muddled through. So I thought that was a good comment. And then infrastructure and العشوائيات. هل امتداد الخدمات الأساسية إلى المناطق العشوائية بتشجع خلق مناطق جديدة؟ No. If you look at the history of these informal areas, in almost all cases, they were already pretty well built before the government came around and put in undersized sewers, undersized and badly done water, and electricity. Electricity came first. So it's always been catch-up. So I don't think the argument that we are encouraging more informal development through providing those areas which are desperate for improved infrastructure, I don't agree with that argument. And I think that's it. I hope I was able to respond.
So I'd like to pick up on some of the themes in the questions about, you know, I guess skeptics of small is beautiful, which I am one. I'm very skeptical of the beauty of small things. And you know, there's been some talk today about top-down and bottom-up. And for me, these are not useful categories at all. I think they're very misleading categories. And I think both of those categories harbor what I would call fantasies of homogeneity, right? As if there's not fights among people in an informal settlement. As if all the rich and powerful people agree with each other. I always think back to what people call one of the milestones of city planning in the United States, which was a plan of Chicago done in 1909 by Burnham and his team. And for me, the amazing thing about this document, and it's huge and beautiful illustrations and all of this, it was a private effort done by a businessmen's association in Chicago. And what it was their drastic attempt to even get the powerful people in the city to agree, right? Even the most powerful people have to work and hustle really hard to try to get something done. And so, you know, in terms of what we as designers and makers can do, I mean, whether it's a notion of regional planning or a notion of, you know, maybe everyone agrees in Newark, which I wish it were true. Some business owners actually are threatening to bring lawsuits against a new law that would require public access to the water, right? So even among 300,000 of us, unfortunately, not so much agreement. And so what I'm really interested in is how our design processes can be opened up, and that's never a simple thing, right? If getting anything done seems impossible, doing anything that might seem to make that more complicated or take more time encounters a lot of unreasonable resistance, but also a lot of reasonable resistance. But the pitch is that if we can do it in the right way, that it actually begins to open the possibility of training in self-abstraction. And this, I think, goes back to what Alinsky talked about when he talked about building power, right? So how do we, as individuals, abstract from ourselves into things into which we think we belong, right? Whether it's a nation, like how am I an American? How do I fit into the class structure? How do I fit into a race? How do all of these abstractions touch down into the concrete materiality of people? And on one hand, we might say, oh, abstraction, it's so unfair, it's so generalizing. But I think that's a trap, right? You know, we only could imagine decisions made on a regional scale if somehow we all can look at that decision later and say, we did that. You know, we did that somehow collectively. And that doesn't mean we all agree with it, but it means that if we're going to imagine a democracy of the built environment that coexists with a market economy, we need to think about ways that once we're done doing whatever we're doing, we all can come together and say, yeah, we did that. So, you know, in terms of the possibility of regional planning or doing things at a scale beyond the scale of Newark, I mean, I think it's all that kind of thinking that would lead us to the place that I am feeling we all want to get to. And then the last piece about remaking and revision, you know, those things, I mean, certainly there's a lot more riverfront to go. If only we had the money and the focus to get it done. So certainly there's more left for later. And in terms of laws and things like that, you know, the zoning workshops that I showed are really meant to try to take something that up until now has been done once every 50 years and make it a more responsive system, right? And it's not responsive because it's an interactive online thing. It's responsive, ideally, because these are the social rules according to which we've all agreed to operate. And therefore, when new things happen, we need to adjust the rules. And they're malleable and plastic things. And in some ways, the understanding of both the social infrastructure of our environment and, of course, the materiality of the environment itself, I think the ultimate goal would be for everyone to share that understanding of these things as socially plastic, as changeable by us. And again, then we can look back and say, who did that? Oh, right, we did.
Thank you, Dave. Well, okay. I think just as we're getting close to the closing of this session, I think it's actually very interesting to listen to the different narratives that are actually coming through the conversations. And I think very often when we talk about planning, a lot of people come with extreme narratives. There's the narrative of the urban renewal, demolishing all the slums. We want to live, all of us, as if all of us want to live في التجمع الخامس. We want something that looks like this. There's on the other extreme, the narrative of romanticizing the slum, thinking about the slum as a place that's kind of this romantic place where everybody عايز زبالين or عايز بيت خرالة, everybody wants to live. And I don't think that you can get anywhere through either narrative. I think there's got to be some pragmatic narrative that acknowledges there's some demographic reality that we've got to live with. There's some physical reality of all the built environment that looks ugly, built out of brick and concrete, but it's there, and there's a lot of investment that went into it, and a lot of people living there. But at the same time, you need to have parks, you need to have transportation, you need to have infrastructure, you need to have all of these things. And I think somewhere within that pragmatic reality is where we need to exist, not the 2050 plan of demolishing half of Cairo, and at the same time not acknowledging that 10 or 20 years from now, Cairo is going to be a big slum, which I don't think is an acceptable reality for all of us. I think there's got to be some different solutions that are a mix of upgrading, a mix of improvement, a mix of creating green areas, a mix of also creating some new developments. And I think within that narrative, we need to find that space. Thank you so much. Omar is going to give us some concluding remarks and maybe some logistics, and then we'll close the day.